So here's a picture of well, pandemic aside, what normally happens December 10th every year in Stockholm, Sweden. And December 10th is an important date. We'll kind of talk about why. This is the actual Nobel Prize ceremony. See, everybody's very well dressed. The royal family is actually sitting over here. And then you can also notice that there's an orchestra here. This is a bust of Alfred Nobel down there, by the way. You'll notice there's no American flags here, and there's a reason for this. That's because the Nobel Prize is awarded in Sweden, not in the United States. In fact, you can actually see the colors of the Swedish flag right up here. So what is going on? How do we get to this point is really kind of the big question that you may want to know, you may want to find an answer to. And for us to understand where you get to this point, we've got to talk a little bit about who Alfred Nobel really was. So you probably know a little bit about Alfred Nobel. He's very, very famous, or was a very, very famous inventor. He was a chemist. He's an engineer. And he was born in the early 1800s, so 1833 in Stockholm. Like typical inventors and scientists, normally they're not known for running marathons. Oftentimes, many scientists smoke, they drink. He is no exception to this at all. And he actually lived in pretty poor health overall. He was pretty reclusive. That is to say, he didn't like dealing with people. Although, ironically, he was philanthropic. So as he made some money, he would donate some away to various causes. He ended up dying late 1800s in Italy. Here's an image of his tombstone. He's buried in Stockholmsian, Sweden, which I'm told is in Stockholm. What's interesting about him is that out of all of his contributions he's made to mankind, the most prominent one is probably dynamite. He held over 300 patents, and dynamite is the one he's most associated with. And it has a lot of utility to it for humanity, right? So if you're trying to build a highway and there's a big rock in the way, what do? You blow the rock up. Mining relies upon things like dynamite. However, because it's a highly energetic material, a lot of people look at dynamite, or back then they did, and they probably still do to this day, as this awful thing, right? A really, really bad thing. And so for that reason, he was nicknamed in French, Le Marchand de la Mort, which means the merchant of death. Now, what's interesting about him is that as he discovered dynamite, he started to accumulate a fair amount of wealth. And because he was reclusive, he wasn't married, he didn't have kids. To help him with his affairs, he actually had a staff. So he actually had servants that would work for him. At the end of his life, he had written a will where in the will, and you can actually see excerpts of the will right here, he left roughly 6% of his will to his family and his servants. So these weren't his actual biological family. Well, they were his biological family. These were like his aunts and uncles, but that's kind of where he left most of his money. And then about 94% of it was used to basically create an annual prize, some sort of an annual academic prize. You're going to award it to somebody who, during the preceding year, shall have conferred the greatest benefit on mankind. What does that mean for us? If you volunteer at your church, you're not probably going to win a Nobel Prize. If you pick up trash on the highway, you're probably not going to win a Nobel Prize. If you help tutor somebody in social studies, probably not going to be in the running for a Nobel Prize. You have to have a very significant contribution in order to win a Nobel Prize. So what is this prize? Well, about 5 years after he died, and he died on December 10th, and this is why the date is so important, because that's when they hold the ceremony. About 5 years after he died, the Swedish government established the Nobel Foundation. What they're responsible for doing is awarding the prize, more or less. Now, the requirements for winning the Nobel Prize is that anybody could conceivably win it, but usually what you're looking for are people that have made a significant impact to humanity. Pretty big impact overall here. You also have to be alive to win the Nobel Prize as well, too. So you really can't, for a good example of this is Stephen Hawking, right? So Stephen Hawking never won a Nobel Prize in his life. He died a couple of years ago. He will not win a Nobel Prize ever. And the reason is because he's died. You have to be living to have won a Nobel Prize. So, or how do they give the Nobel Prize? Well, they give it out in a variety of different categories. So on Monday, they gave it out in medicine and physiology, or medicine or physiology. Today was physics. Tomorrow's chemistry. So that's the big one, of course. Thursday is literature. And then the Peace Prize, that's usually the most controversial one. That's given out on Friday. Next week, on Monday, they'll do the economic sciences. And they've been doing that since about the late 1960s. Okay, so what does it take to win a Nobel Prize? Again, this is a former chairman from the Nobel Selection Committee. Basically what he said is that the achievement should somehow open a door. It should somehow open our eyes. We should see things in a different way. So they're not looking for generally ordinary people. They're looking for people that have made a significant contribution that have really changed the way that we've kind of looked at the world. So what are some examples of that? Well, here's a couple that you probably can think of. Albert Einstein won the physics award in 1921, not for E equals mc squared. He won it for the photoelectric effect, the same photoelectric effect that we talked about in Unit 3. Fleming, you're probably familiar with, Alexander Fleming, won in 1945 for the discovery of penicillin. Watson and Crick won in 1962 for the discovery of DNA. You might know Marie and Pierre Curie. You may have heard of them before. Well, they shared the Nobel Prize in 1903 with Henri Becquerel for the discovery of radioactivity, which of course we use nowadays in power plants and other nuclear processes. A couple other ones too. The Dalai Lama won in 1993, and then Willard Libby won in 1960 for carbon-14 dating techniques. All right, so how do they actually award the Nobel Prize? It's a big, long process. It's about 15 months long to do it from soup to nuts. The announcements that are coming out this week started way back in September, not last month, like as in 13 months ago, September. What normally happens around this time is the Nobel Foundation mails out letters to pretty prominent, influential people. So they mail them out to academics, professors, scientists, people in government, people who've won the Nobel Prize before. And from that generates a list of roughly 3,000 names. And what's interesting is that the nominations are actually kept secret for about 50 years. And this will play a very important role here in a couple minutes, and I'll explain here in a minute. Phase 2 is when they actually assemble the names. So they collect all these different letters back from people that have made recommendations. And from that, they compile a list of all the different candidates. And then they take that list and they whittle it down to about 300. And so this is one thing I want to point out real quickly here. Just because you're nominated for a Nobel Prize, that is, you're part of the 3,000 names, you get whittled down to 300. So 90% of the people that get nominated for a Nobel Prize, or that were nominated for a Nobel Prize last year, they don't get considered for it. This is the short list. And remember, this short list is applied to 6 different categories: medicine or physiology, physics, chemistry, literature, Peace Prize, and then economic sciences. After this list is basically put together, the respective committees for each of those categories, they meet and they start to do some research on each of the candidates. Each candidate that's on that short list, they do pretty extensive research on them. On the scientific side, it's not as simple as you do an experiment, you're going to win a Nobel Prize. You have to have made a discovery, which is the hard part, and then that discovery has to be significant enough that people have used it over a significant amount of time so that you're kind of considered one of the best of the best. So this research phase lasts over several months, and then eventually the committee gets back together for something called an advisor review. And what happens here is the candidates, they actually review the candidates, and then there's a lot of discussion as to, should this candidate move up the list? Should this candidate move down the list? It's a very intricate amount of discussion as I understand it. And then finally, the next phase is voting. So this is what happened this morning. So what's really interesting here is that, now remember, all this is over in Europe. So the committee members wake up just like you and I wake up. They put on their pants the same way you and I put on our pants. They go to work the same way you and I go to work, pandemic aside. And they actually take a look at their particular shortlist. And based on that shortlist, they determine, is this person, what people are actually going to win a Nobel Prize? That's pretty much where they're going on, or what they're dealing with. And then they vote as a committee. That's the interesting part of all of this, that nobody really knows who's going to win the Nobel Prize in the morning. The committee gets together, they review all the candidates, and then they vote. And then from that, they select up to 3 people that can win in a given category. So as we saw for the physics one, they actually they announced that 3 people would be winning the Nobel Prize. Now, this is all done secretively. And when the candidates are voted, when the committee votes upon the candidates, or when they vote for a particular candidate, once they've made an agreement that these are the people that they want to win the Nobel Prize for this particular category, you can imagine that the next thing they're going to do is get on the phone, and they're actually going to call the candidates and let them know, hey, you've won the Nobel Prize. Sometimes it's pretty straightforward. You just call the person at their house or at their laboratory and let them know. Sometimes it's a little less straightforward. I remember hearing a story many years ago when I was in graduate school where somebody had won a Nobel Prize, and they were in California, so they're on West Coast time, basically on the other side of the world. While it's basically noon over in Stockholm, it was about 2-3 o'clock in the morning over in California. And so they called this particular scientist and they said, "Hello, we just want to let you know that you've won the Nobel Prize." And the guy answered the phone and he said, "Oh, okay, that's great." And he thought it was a prank. And so he hung up the phone. His wife said, "Who is that?" And he said, "Oh, I think somebody's playing a prank on me. They told me I won a Nobel Prize." And he went back to bed. And he woke up the next morning, a couple hours later, walked down the hallway to the front door to open the front door and check the paper in the morning. And sure enough, he opened up the paper and without a doubt, his picture is right in the front page of the paper saying that he won the Nobel Prize. So he had known. He finally put two and two together. So sometimes it's a little weird like that. And then, of course, there's a giant press release. And this is a picture of what the typical press release kind of looks like. You can see this if you set your timers to wake up pretty early in the morning, 4 or 5 o'clock in the morning here. You can go right onto YouTube in the morning, first thing, and there should be a little link right on the homepage of YouTube. And you click that, and that will actually be the video feed for the Nobel Prize. And when the winners have been contacted, the committee will come out and they will hold their press release, and they'll show who's won the Nobel Prize and for what reasons. And then usually they read a whole big long description of why they picked the people that they picked. So it's this pretty cool little thing. And then there's the next phase in all of this. So as soon as the winners are announced, then there's a whole preparation to get ready for the main event. This is when they actually give out the Nobel Prize. And that is the actual ceremony itself. And that's held in December 10th. And typically, you kind of think about this as being like about a week-long process. Each of the laureates, scientists, the people that won, will fly out to either Stockholm or Oslo, and they'll do a whole bunch of presentations while they're out there. So there'll be a whole bunch of presentations. So people will do just a general talk about their research or their contributions they've made, and then they'll do kind of a really intense technical talk as well too. And so this will happen over the span of several days, and then eventually they'll give out the awards. So the awards are given out. Typically, they give out 24 karat plated, 18 karat green gold medals. So they look kind of something like this. But this is a bust of Alfred Nobel. It's his profile. My favorite part is the diploma. So this is the thing that they'll get. And this is important because it takes a lot of effort to actually determine how they're going to do the diploma. And I'll show you what I mean here in a minute. The diploma is an actual, somebody hand writes in very nice calligraphy in Swedish that this person has won the Nobel Prize for this particular year. This is what they won it for. And then on the other side of the diploma, and we'll look at a couple examples here, there is a graphical representation of that person's contribution. And then, yes, of course, you do get a little bit of money. Typically, you're awarded anywhere from 8 to 10 million Swedish krona, which is equivalent to about $1.1 million today. And then afterwards, you have a big festival, gala, dinner. There's a big celebration, and then that ends the whole 15-month process. But so presumably these are previous Nobel Prize winners, or they're part of the committee. I actually don't know the difference, to be honest with you. So notice everybody's wearing a tuxedo. And here's your Nobel Prize winner right there. This is King Gustav. The Queen is right here. Years ago, I started talking about the Nobel Prize in class. And I had a student that I was having a really, really tough time getting him to connect with the class. We get to this lecture, and he is transfixed on this picture. Like something deeply emotional is going on within him. And so I said, "Is everything all right?" And he said, "That's the Nobel Prize winner right there?" I said, "Yeah, I think it is." He said, "That's the guy announcing the award?" I said, "Yeah, it is." "And that's the king?" He said, "Yeah." And he said, "Do you think the Nobel Prize winner right here, do you think he gets to meet the princess?" So he was so totally into, presumably this is the princess over here. I don't know if that is the princess or not, but that was, that was what his main motivator was, is to get to meet the princess. So here's an example of a diploma that was awarded to Dr. Carl Weinman. This is an especially important one for me because he's the first Nobel Prize winner I've ever met. I was in graduate school when I met him, and he won the 2001 Nobel Prize for the confirmation of something called a Bose-Einstein condensate. In essence, what he did was, this is kind of cool. It was in physics, but this is kind of the really cool part. He took a bunch of rubidium atoms in the gaseous state. These single atoms have a lot of energy to them, a lot of kinetic energy, and you'll see that in the artwork right here. So these red spheres represent rubidium in the gaseous state. And what he did is he used this method called Sisyphus cooling. In essence, what's happening here is that he's blasting these atoms with lasers. As the rubidium atoms come in contact with the laser light, they begin to cool down a little bit. Pretty fascinating. And then they start to cool and cool and cool and cool and cool. And then eventually they all basically condense into this new phase of material, which we call the Bose-Einstein condensate. And this happens around, well, it's near 0 Kelvin. And so that was his major contribution in all of this. I was able to get and make a Bose-Einstein condensate. Him and his researchers were able to do that. Pretty fascinating. I love the artwork here because there's a lot of warm colors that are here and very cool colors that are here. Here's one of my, I like this one too. This is Riccardo Giacconi. I say this is one of my favorite ones because it's pretty neat how he won the Nobel Prize. So this one was given in 2002, and it was basically for the origins of X-rays in outer space. And so what's happening here is this swirling thing here is supposed to represent a photon of light, specifically an X-ray, and it's coming from an object that's emitting a whole bunch of energy, and that object has kind of a ring-like shape to it in the middle. And that's a black hole right there. And so the way to determine where a black hole is in outer space is you look for the X-rays in outer space. If you can find the X-rays, if you can find the beams where the X-rays are coming from, you trace them back. I like this one especially because 18 years later, they gave out the Nobel Prize today for the first actual evidence of a black hole, which is pretty neat. And then you guys may know this one. This is Malala Yousafzai, and she won hers for childhood education. And you'll notice, too, all the other ones are conferred in Stockholm. This one's actually conferred in Norway. I like the artwork here because the medium here is watercolor. And what it's supposed to represent, as I understand it, is this is supposed to represent a teacher. Okay, and the teacher, you'll notice, is multicolored. In this case, they're representing all the different cultures and creeds and races, and anybody can be a teacher in essence. And you'll notice they're all full too. All the colors are all there's a lot of vibrant color to this. These two are supposed to represent students. And you'll notice too, there's a little empty space that's inside here. The teacher's job, of course, is to provide knowledge to fill this space here. And you know that these are the pupils because they're sitting at a desk. This looks like a little desk kind of thing here. So I like this one. I think it's a pretty interesting. That's my interpretation of that picture. Don't know if it's right or not, but a couple facts about the Nobel Prize. So first of all, there's a time lag issue. Typically what happens is somebody makes a discovery. So let's say tomorrow I made a discovery in chemistry. I wouldn't really honestly be eligible to win a Nobel Prize for about 20 years after the discovery. The Nobel Foundation has to actually validate the research. They have to make sure that it is actually a pretty important contribution to humanity, right? And that takes time. The exception to that, though, is the Peace Prize. And so this is where controversy kind of starts to set in. In instances where they award the Peace Prize, you'll see a certain amount of the population, the world population, will say, hey, what a great idea. That's definitely a deserving person for winning a Peace Prize. And then you'll see a small percentage of the population that is completely outraged by the awarding of the Peace Prize here. It seems like every year there's going to be some controversy, and usually that controversy is going to kind of circle around the Peace Prize. Between the years 1901 and 2013, there were about 600 Nobel Prizes that were awarded, and that translated to about 900 laureates. And you say, well, how come these two numbers aren't equal with each other? But the reason is because it's very common to see 2 or 3 people win a given Nobel Prize. So that's why you have way more laureates than you do the actual Nobel Prizes themselves. Remember how we talked about how there's a 50-year gap between when the nominations are made and when they're actually publicly announced, or where they're publicly available, that information is? This is where it kind of gets interesting here. So this is year 2020, and if you subtract 50 from that, that works out to 1970. So if the information has not already been provided now, it certainly will be, but it'd be really interesting to see who was nominated in 1970. That information will be coming out here shortly if it isn't out already. What's really fascinating, though, is that if you look through the data, and I think the data is actually curated by the Nobel Foundation, if you look for the years 1935 and 1939, you're going to see these two names, Benito Mussolini and Adolf Hitler. What's interesting about Adolf Hitler is supposedly that was a joke nomination. I don't know whether or not that was true, but that's the version of the story I had heard, that his name was eventually withdrawn because the person who had nominated him was just joking around. What's really interesting, though, is know your history a little bit. Joseph Stalin was actually nominated in 45 and 48 for attempting to end World War II. And he was supposedly nominated along with Franklin Delano Roosevelt and Winston Churchill. And then perhaps the most controversial Nobel Prize winner was this guy, Egetz Moniz. what his contribution was, so he was a Portuguese doctor. What his contribution was is he was the first person to really treat or cure psychosis. The way he won the Nobel Prize is he came up with something called a prefrontal lobotomy. The problem, though, is that yes, it did cure the psychosis, but it also removed a person's personality. And so they kind of would live in this sort of non-existent vegetative state. Kind of a sad situation overall. He won the Nobel Prize very shortly after coming up with this medical procedure. And now I would imagine that the Nobel Committee kind of looks back at that going, yeah, maybe we shouldn't have awarded that. This is the exact reason why, or one of the reasons why, there's such a lag between when something is kind of discovered and then when it's actually awarded. You're trying to prevent instances like this happening. When we look back at it, we look back and we go, yeah, that probably wasn't a smart idea to do something like that. Here's some interesting winners. So the first year the Nobel Prize came out, it was awarded to the International Red Cross, and it was accepted by Henri Dunant. I like this one because it was an organization that won the Nobel Prize, the Nobel Peace Prize. Organizations can win the Nobel Peace Prize, and you're actually seeing this a lot in the news right now. Is the World Health Organization going to win the Nobel Peace Prize this year, considering we're in the middle of a pandemic, which we haven't seen one like this since 1918? You'll probably know this woman right here. This is Madame Curie. So she went by the name Marie Skłodowska-Curie. She won in 1903 for the discovery of radioactivity in physics, and then she won several years later in 1911 for the isolation of radium and also polonium as well too. Of course, she was the first woman to win a Nobel Prize. And then you've got Albert Einstein, who won the Nobel Prize for the photoelectric effect, which we've talked about in this class before. A couple other ones, you've probably seen this picture if you've seen a biology book before, textbook. This is Watson and Crick, and they're looking at the structure of DNA, pretty big structure. Mother Teresa had won in 1979 for her missionary work that she had done throughout her life. And then Malala Yousafzai won in 2014. There's a lot of controversy when she won in 2014 because the year prior, people were talking about how at 16 years old, she should have won the Nobel Prize then. Then eventually the committee got it right and they awarded her the Nobel Prize in 2014. Although what's interesting is she won it at 17. And if you know what most 17-year-olds are doing around this part of their life, many of them, not most of them, but many of them are looking at going to college. In other words, they're writing entrance essays. And so you can imagine she's applying to go to college at 17 years old and she's writing her essay. And it's like, why should the University of Alabama accept you? Well, I don't know. I mean, I won a Nobel Peace Prize. They're not exactly handing those out on the street corners or anything like that. So I'll round this out and just say there have been several people that have not won Nobel Prizes, and I guess you could classify them as being kind of snubs. So a good example of this is Mahatma Gandhi. He never won a Nobel Prize, even though he was deeply, deeply involved with nonviolent protests against the British in India. What's interesting is the year that he died, they did not award a Peace Prize. And so that's led several people to speculate that maybe they didn't give out a Nobel Prize in peace in his honor. Maybe he should have won the Nobel Prize and they kind of were like, oh, that's our screw up. We'll just not give out a Peace Prize this year. Stephen Hawking never won a Nobel Prize. The reason for this is because he did a lot of what we call proto-science. So he did a lot of theoretical science that really hadn't been supported by any research evidence at all. And that's mostly due to the fact that a lot of what he had proposed over the course of his life, even to this day, we don't have the technology to be able to confirm it yet. I imagine, though, in the next 50 years, you'll see a lot of people that will win Nobel Prizes confirming some of the predictions that Stephen Hawking had made. If you want to win a Nobel Prize, I probably would tell you this is probably the easiest way to do it. Take one of Hawking's theories and try and prove it right by actually providing some sort of experimental evidence. And I bet you'll win a Nobel Prize for that. And then Jonas Salk, he never won, and he's interesting because he developed the polio vaccine. And so that obviously eradicated that disease. So kind of odd that he would never win for that, but